For years, Brad Pitt's name was tied to one of Hollywood's most painful family battles. But behind the headlines, court filings, and public statements was a story far more complicated than the rumors suggested. Pitt rarely spoke openly about the most personal parts of the conflict, while his family's private struggles became public news around the world. Then, after years of silence and legal battles, new statements began changing how people viewed the story. The question is, what was Pitt finally willing to say? The story did not begin with a courtroom. It began with a flight. In September 2016, Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie, and their children were traveling from France to Los Angeles when an incident involving the family became the turning point in their lives. What happened during that flight would soon become the subject of investigations, conflicting accounts, and years of public discussion. Only days later, Jolie filed for divorce. Suddenly, one of Hollywood's most famous couples was no longer presenting the image fans had known for years. Their marriage, which had begun in 2014 after a long relationship, was ending, but the divorce itself was only the beginning. Reports soon surfaced about what allegedly happened during the flight. Some accounts described an argument involving Pitt and one of the children. Other details were disputed. Because the incident involved minors, much of what was discussed publicly came from legal filings, reports, and statements from people connected to the case rather than from the family speaking openly together. That distinction matters. Over the years, the story became filled with headlines that often sounded more certain than the available evidence. Allegations were repeated. Counterclaims followed. Public opinion formed quickly. But official investigations did not simply confirm every accusation that appeared in the press. The FBI investigated an incident involving Pitt and Jolie's family. In 2016, the agency closed its investigation without bringing charges against Pitt. The Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services also investigated allegations concerning the children, and Pitt was not criminally charged. Still, the damage to the family relationship was already enormous. For Pitt, the collapse was not just about losing a marriage. He was suddenly facing questions about his role as a father, his public image, and the future of his relationship with his children. And there was another problem. The divorce did not stay inside the family. It became a public battle that would continue for years, with new legal disputes appearing long after the original incident had faded from the headlines. What began with one terrible moment would eventually become a much larger story about trust, parenting, addiction, forgiveness, and whether a broken family can ever truly go back to normal. And the next part is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because a couple everyone once called Hollywood royalty was already falling apart long before the world saw it. For years, Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie looked almost untouchable. They were two of the biggest stars in the world. Their relationship had started under enormous public attention, and their growing family became a constant subject of fascination. But behind the famous photographs, their relationship was changing. Pitt and Jolie had 6 children together, including 3 children they adopted from different countries. Their family life was complicated, busy, and constantly watched by the public. Then came 2016. Jolie filed for divorce in September, citing irreconcilable differences. She also requested physical custody of the children, while asking that Pitt receive visitation. The story quickly became much bigger than a celebrity divorce. Reports about the private incident on the family's flight began appearing. Pitt later acknowledged that he had struggled with alcohol during the marriage. In a 2017 interview with GQ Style, he spoke openly about his drinking and said he had stopped using alcohol after the separation. That admission became one of the most important pieces of the story because it changed the conversation. Instead of simply being a glamorous actor caught inside a Hollywood divorce, Pitt was talking about personal problems that he believed had affected his family. He described a period when he had been drinking heavily and explained that he had replaced alcohol with other ways of dealing with life. He also spoke about the emotional pain of losing his family structure. But even as Pitt became more open about his own behavior, the larger family conflict remained unresolved. Jolie's legal filings and Pitt's responses presented different versions of their relationship and its breakdown. Their lawyers continued fighting over custody and financial matters. And while the adults were battling through lawyers, the children were growing up. That changed everything. The children were not simply witnesses to a famous divorce. They were individuals developing their own relationships with both parents. As the years passed, some of those relationships became strained. The public could see only fragments. A court document here, a statement there, a photograph, a report from an unnamed source. But the most important conversations were happening away from cameras. That is what makes this story so difficult to understand. There was never one single moment that explained everything. There were years of relationship problems, personal struggles, competing claims, and painful consequences. Pitt eventually described his own journey toward sobriety and accountability. But accepting responsibility for personal mistakes does not automatically repair a damaged family. And that became the next battle. Because once the marriage was over, the question was no longer simply whether Brad and Angelina could separate. The question was whether they could ever agree on how their children should move forward. And that fight would last far longer than either of them probably expected. The most disturbing part of the story is also the part that needs the most care. When a celebrity family falls apart, rumors can travel faster than facts. And in the Pitt Jolie case, that happened on a massive scale. After Jolie filed for divorce in September 2016, allegations about an incident involving Pitt and one of the children became public. The details were serious, but the public was never given a complete, independently verified account of everything that happened inside that family. That is why separating allegations from established facts is so important. The FBI investigated an incident involving Pitt on a private aircraft. The investigation was later closed without criminal charges being filed against him. At the same time, child welfare authorities investigated allegations involving the children. Pitt was not criminally charged in connection with the incident, but there is an important distinction here. The absence of criminal charges does not mean every family dispute was resolved or that everyone involved experienced the events in the same way. It simply means prosecutors did not bring a criminal case against Pitt based on those investigations. Meanwhile, Pitt's own public comments added another layer. In his 2017 GQ style interview, he acknowledged that alcohol had become a serious problem during his marriage. He said he had stopped drinking and discussed the need to change his life. That admission was significant because it came directly from Pitt himself. For years, fans had seen him as a calm, confident movie star who seemed to have everything. Now he was acknowledging that his private life had become much more difficult than the public image suggested. But the family conflict continued. The divorce and custody proceedings became a long-running legal matter. Temporary arrangements were made for the children, and the relationship between the parents remained deeply strained. Then came another source of tension, Pitt's effort to rebuild his relationship with his children. Because the children were minors when the divorce began, much of the custody process happened privately. As they grew older, however, some of them began making their own public choices. That is where the story took an emotional turn. Years after the divorce, several of the children appeared to distance themselves from the Pitt family name or publicly identify more closely with Jolie's side of the family. Those choices were personal, and it is impossible to know everything happening inside those relationships. But the public noticed, and every new development created another wave of headlines about a father trying to reconnect with children who had grown up in the shadow of one of Hollywood's most painful family conflicts. The biggest question was no longer what happened on that flight. It was what happened afterward. Because investigations can close a case, courts can issue orders, divorces can become final. But none of those things automatically repair a family's emotional wounds. And as the children grew older, their own choices began revealing just how deep those wounds might have been. The hardest part of this story may not be Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie. It may be the 6 children who grew up while their parents fought one of Hollywood's longest and most public family battles. When Pitt and Jolie separated in 2016, their children were still young. Maddox was 15, Pax was 12, Zahara was 11, Shiloh was 10, Knox and Vivian were only 8. Suddenly, their private family life became international news. But the children did not choose that attention. They had grown up traveling with famous parents, attending premieres, and living under constant media interest. Now their parents were separated, and every legal development could become a headline. At first, the biggest question was custody. Jolie requested primary physical custody, while Pitt sought custody and visitation. A temporary arrangement was reached that allowed Pitt to spend time with the children under specific conditions, and the family continued working through the court system. Over time, those arrangements changed. Pitt also began working on himself. His 2017 interview with GQ Style was unusually personal. He talked about giving up alcohol and confronting the ways he had handled pain. But rebuilding trust inside a family is not the same as changing a habit. It takes time, and it cannot be forced. As the children grew older, their individual relationships with their parents became more private and complicated. Maddox, the oldest, became particularly important to the public story because reports connected him to the 2016 aircraft incident. Years later, he publicly uses Jolie's surname in some contexts, while other children also made choices that attracted attention. In 2024, Vivian was credited as Vivian Jolie on the Broadway production The Outsiders, rather than using the Pitt surname. Zahara also publicly introduced herself using the name Zahara Marley Jolie when joining Alpha Kappa Alpha at Spelman College in 2023. These choices do not tell us everything about their private relationships with their father, but they do show something important. The children were becoming adults. They were no longer simply names inside custody documents. They were making decisions about their own identities. And that meant Brad Pitt could not control how the next chapter of the family story would be written. This is where the emotional side of the story becomes especially painful. A parent can apologize. A parent can change. A parent can hope for another chance. But the child still gets to decide whether, when, and how that relationship is rebuilt. For years, Pitt continued his life and career while the family conflict remained part of the public conversation. Then another battle emerged, one that had little to do with custody and everything to do with money, ownership, and trust. It involved a French estate called Chateau Miraval, and what happened there would turn the family conflict into an even bigger legal war. The divorce was supposed to separate two people. Instead, the legal battles kept finding new ways to bring them back together. One of the biggest disputes centered on Chateau Miraval, the French estate and winery that Pitt and Jolie bought together in 2008. For a while, Miraval seemed like the opposite of their Hollywood lives. It was private, beautiful, far away from the cameras. But after their marriage ended, the property became the center of another bitter legal fight. In 2021, Jolie sold her interest in the winery to Tenuta del Mondo, part of the Stoli Group. Pitt later sued, arguing that Jolie had violated an agreement between them concerning the ownership of the property. Jolie's side disputed Pitt's claims. What followed was not simply a disagreement over a vineyard. It became another courtroom battle filled with accusations, business documents, and arguments about what the former couple had agreed to before their marriage collapsed. Pitt's lawyers accused Jolie of selling her share without his approval. Jolie's legal team argued that there was no enforceable agreement requiring the kind of consent Pitt claimed. The case became even more complicated because both sides began making claims about the other person's conduct during a relationship and after the divorce. Once again, private family history was appearing inside legal documents. That is one of the strangest features of the entire Pitt Jolie story. A relationship that once played out on movie premieres and magazine covers was now being reconstructed through lawyers, contracts, court filings, and competing accounts. And Miraval was not just about money. For Pitt, the property appeared to carry deep emotional meaning. He had continued working with the winery and publicly connected himself to its development. For Jolie, selling her stake represented a major financial and personal decision after the marriage had ended. Whatever viewers may think about either side, the legal dispute shows how difficult it can be to truly separate lives after a high-profile marriage. The divorce may end the relationship, but businesses, property, children, money, and old promises can keep people legally connected for years. And while the Miraval fight continued, something else was changing. The children were becoming adults. That meant they were increasingly able to speak, or remain silent, for themselves. Some made public choices that appeared to distance them from their father's surname. Others stayed almost completely out of the public conversation. Meanwhile, Pitt continued his career and began speaking more openly about his own past. He was no longer presenting himself as someone who had everything under control. He was talking about mistakes, about drinking, about recovery, and about trying to become a better version of himself. But there was one thing he could not simply fix with a public interview. The relationships with his children belonged to them too. And that brings us to the part of the story many people misunderstand. Brad Pitt did eventually break his silence. But his most revealing comments were not necessarily about the scandal itself. They were about the man he believed he had become afterward. And those admissions would force people to look at the entire story differently. For years, people wanted Brad Pitt to explain everything. They wanted the perfect interview. The one moment when he would sit down, look into the camera, and finally tell the whole story. But that moment never really came. Instead, Pitt revealed pieces of his story over time. And strangely, those smaller admissions may tell us more than one dramatic confession ever could. In 2017, Pitt gave one of his most personal interviews to GQ Style. He spoke about his drinking and admitted that alcohol had become a serious problem. He said he had stopped drinking and was trying to understand the person he had been during the final years of his marriage. That was an important shift. Pitt was not simply blaming the media. He was not pretending that everything had gone wrong because of someone else. He was looking inward. He also described the emotional pain that followed the breakup of his family. His words suggested that he understood he had work to do, both personally and emotionally, but there was something he did not do. He did not publicly reveal every private detail about his children, and that restraint matters, because while the public wanted answers, the people most affected were still living with the consequences. Over the following years, Pitt continued rebuilding his career. He won an Academy Award for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in 2020 and remained one of the industry's biggest stars. From the outside, it could have looked like he had moved on, but the family story did not disappear. Court battles continued. The Mirabel dispute continued, and reports about the children's relationships with their parents continued appearing in the press. Then, in 2024, Pitt's personal life entered another chapter when reports confirmed that his youngest daughter, Vivian, was professionally credited without the Pitt surname for The Outsiders on Broadway. Again, it was impossible to know exactly what the decision meant emotionally. A name change does not automatically explain a family relationship, but it became another public reminder that Pitt's children were now adults or close to adulthood, and were beginning to make choices that belonged to them. This is where the story becomes less about Hollywood and more about consequences. Pitt could control what he said in interviews. He could control his career. He could work on his sobriety. He could fight legal battles. But he could not control how his children felt about the past. And that may be the hardest lesson in the entire story. Changing yourself does not guarantee that everyone you hurt will immediately trust you again. Sometimes the consequences continue even after behavior changes. Sometimes forgiveness takes years. And sometimes people choose distance. That does not automatically tell us who is right or wrong. It simply shows how complicated family wounds can become. And there was still one question hanging over everything. If Pitt had truly changed, could that change ever repair the damage? The answer may be found not in another courtroom or another headline, but in what happens when the cameras finally disappear. Maybe the most uncomfortable truth about this story is that there is no perfect ending. There is no final interview that can explain every argument, no court ruling that can repair every family relationship, and no headline that can tell us exactly what happened behind closed doors. What we do know is that Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie's marriage ended in 2016 after years together and 6 children. We know that allegations surrounding a 2016 flight led to investigations. We know that the FBI closed its investigation without criminal charges against Pitt. We also know that Pitt later spoke publicly about his struggle with alcohol and his decision to stop drinking. Those are documented parts of the story. Other claims remain disputed, and that distinction should never be forgotten. Celebrity stories often turn complicated human situations into simple characters. One person is a villain, another is a victim, and everyone else becomes part of the drama. Real families are rarely that simple. Pitt has acknowledged serious personal problems and has spoken about changing his life. Jolie has continued raising her children and building her own career. Their children have grown up. Some have made public choices about their names and identities. Others have kept their feelings private. And perhaps that privacy is something they deserve. Because the biggest consequence of this entire story may not be what happened to Brad Pitt's reputation. It may be what happened to a family that once looked inseparable. A relationship that began under enormous public attention eventually became a legal and emotional battle that lasted for years. The public saw the photographs. The public saw the headlines. The public saw the court disputes. But the children had to live the reality behind them. That is why calling this simply a Hollywood scandal misses the deeper story. It is a story about how private mistakes can become permanent public memories. It is a story about how addiction can damage relationships. It is a story about how accountability can begin with admitting that something went wrong. But it is also a story about limits. A person can change. A person can become sober. A person can regret the past. But another person still has the right to decide whether they are ready to trust again. And perhaps that is the one part of the story that no celebrity status can fix. Brad Pitt may continue making films. The legal battles may eventually end. The headlines may eventually become old news. But for a family, the past does not always disappear when the cameras move on. Sometimes the real ending is much quieter. It is a slow work of rebuilding trust, accepting consequences, and allowing people to make their own choices about the future. So, was the 2016 incident the moment that destroyed everything? Or was it simply the final explosion after years of problems that had already been building? Do you think Brad Pitt's decision to openly confront his personal struggles was a real turning point? Or do you think some family damage can never truly be repaired? Let me know in the comments below.